It's Saturday, September 16th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Documenting Congress Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Austin, Texas with Dr. Michael Gillette. Mike earned his bachelor's in government and PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Gillette began working at the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library, where he eventually became the Director of Oral History and Acquisitions. In 1991, he left the LBJ Library to become Director of the Center for Legislative Archives at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Dr. Gillette retired from National Archives in 2003 and returned to Austin, where he became the Executive Director of Humanities Texas. He retired in 2019. Over the course of his career, Dr. Gillette has served on the boards of numerous organizations, including the Distinguished Visitors of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University, as well as the Board of Directors of the Congressional Education Foundation at the Robert C. Byrd Center, and the Everett Dirksen Center, Congressional Leadership Center in Pekin, Illinois. He's the author of 2 books published by Oxford University Press, Launching the War on Poverty, An Oral History, and Lady Bird Johnson, An Oral History. Dr. Gillette, Mike, thank you so much for inviting me to Austin, into your home, to talk a little bit about your work in libraries, archives, and documenting Congress.
Happy to have you here.
It is a pleasure. It's very hot, very muggy, so it's about par for the course for Austin in September. So let's begin at the beginning. A place that was also probably pretty hot and pretty muggy. Your childhood and upbringing. Where'd you grow up?
Grew up in Baytown. It is a suburb of Houston, oil refining community. My dad was a lawyer there, and it was a good place to grow up.
Now, did you grow up in a family that was very civically involved, politically involved?
Well, my father was certainly civically involved. I wouldn't say that he was politically involved, other than the fact that he voted.
Sure.
But he was very active in the Chamber of Commerce and other organizations. For him, the ultimate was getting himself elected to the Houston Port Authority as a commissioner of the Port of Houston. He loved the water.
That was an elected position.
It was elected.
Okay.
But it was I'm not sure I know what the electorate was, to tell you the truth.
Fair point.
But it was highly sought after, and of course he and my mother were able to travel all over the world, generating business for the Port of Houston. And,
so where did your interest in government and politics and history come from? Where do you credit that, or to whom do you credit that?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I know I was not propelled toward the sciences as my older brother was. I think I was always interested in history, and even my teachers in high school were able to support that interest. And I was a government major, and the university had a strong faculty in government at the time, and I think they still do, yeah. But I was also very interested in history, and we had some wonderful historians. H. Wayne Morgan, Robert Devine, the diplomatic historian, and Clarence Lasby. Bud Lasby was a dear friend and a much loved professor. But at one point, when I was still an undergraduate, I became very interested in Huey Long and Long's operations as a senator, as someone running for president, and I became associated with T. Harry Williams, who at the time was just finishing his biography of Huey Long. And I managed to get in with Earl Christenberry, the guy who ran Huey Long's Senate office and handled a lot of his finances. And Williams had never been able to crack that nut, but because Christenberry wasn't threatened by me. I was just a young undergraduate, and he was happy to spend time with me. So
You were T. Harry's stalking horse.
Well, that was one of my earliest oral history interviews.
That would have been in what year would that have been?
Oh, it
give or
would have
take?
been about 1966.
Okay.
I was still an undergraduate at the time.
So 66. This is
I graduated in 68.
This is completely beside the point. But you would have been at the University of Texas when the shooting happened.
Except for the fact that it took place in August.
Okay.
And I was not there.
Well, thankfully,
in August.
Yeah. That.
I was either at home or in Chile. We had an exchange program with the University of Chile, and I participated in that in '66 too. So.
Okay. So
but I had a lot of friends who were on campus at the time.
I'm sure that was something terrible. So tell me, you're talking about T. Harry Williams. I think the Oral History Center at LSU is named after T. Harry Williams, for good reason. So tell me how you got plugged into the LBJ library.
Harry Middleton was the director of the library. First of all, let me fill in a little gap here. After I graduated, or when I graduated, I signed up for Vista Volunteers organization. And was trained in the Roxbury South End area of Boston, and then we were dispatched around New England, and I ended up being placed in a Model Cities program in Worcester, Massachusetts. I spent 2 years working as a Vista volunteer for Model Cities in Worcester.
Worcester.
And it was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot about community action, working with community action, and of course that became a subject of an oral history that I did later on the community action program after I had an opportunity to do 5 sessions with Sergeant Shriver.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, I was just a run-of-the-mill Vista volunteer in the urban city of Worcester. In any event, I stayed in touch with T. Harry Williams, and he put me in touch with his co-author, Frank Friedel, on their textbook, and I started doing some independent studies with Friedel. And that's what brought me to Austin to interview LBJ.
Okay, right.
Yeah, in 1970, I believe is that right? It was in 70.
And as we were talking about earlier, you would have been one of the first people to interview him one-on-one, apart from
that's right.
the great Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. Were you nervous?
You know, I'm sure I was. I'm sure I was up for it. I can't say that I was nervous. I had my questions. I knew what I wanted to ask him. It was really about his association with President Roosevelt when he was a young congressman.
So it was a very targeted oral history.
Very focused. And of course, that is a subject that Lyndon Johnson loved to talk about. It was very important to him. It was part of his, the critical part of his political life when he successfully ran for Congress and had the support of FDR and the White House. There was another element to this. In fact, my high school history teacher, a woman named Nettie Lee Kellum Bradshaw, had written to him ahead of time and asked him to see me. And this was at a time when LBJ wasn't doing interviews except for the Cronkite series. But because he had dated her before he met Mrs. Johnson. She was Jesse Kellum's first cousin. He was the station manager for LBJ. But she had dated him in Washington when the two of them were there. And so that must have carried some weight, I would think, because he wrote her a nice letter afterwards, the interview. And in any event, it was I was interviewing other New Dealers at the time, so it was the focus of my interest. And then I spent a year at LSU and decided in graduate school after the 2 years and decided that I wanted to go back to Austin.
Okay. And so you came back, and by this time, did you have a sense that oral history was something that you wanted to pursue more fully, or was that just something that developed? That maybe just sort of fell into.
I did want to pursue it, and in fact, I did pursue it almost right away.
Okay.
By this time, I had already done maybe 40 or so interviews.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah.
On the LBJ and the New Deal, LBJ and the Roosevelt administration. So I was more seasoned, and it just so happened that my first seminar that I signed up for when I entered the graduate school at UT was with Joe B. France, and France had been the oral history guy on the LBJ project. He'd been the director of the LBJ oral history project. The topic was education and of the seminar, and Joe France suggested that since I had no better idea, that I do some oral histories on the Sweat v. Painter case, the desegregation of the attempted desegregation of the University of Texas Law School. And I had never heard of it. It was not something that we talked about or knew much about. But the white newspapers made it sound like this guy just showed up and applied for law school. This mailman who just wanted to be a lawyer. And then when I read the black newspapers, however, I realized that the NAACP had been planning this suit for months. They hadn't been able to find a plaintiff. And so then I got in touch with Heman Sweat in Atlanta and flew to Atlanta and spent a whole weekend with him.
Oh, wow.
Getting his interview, which I guess no one else ever got. And then started doing others who were behind the furnishing momentum for the lawsuit. And it's a subject that interests me today.
Wow.
Anyway.
Whatever became of those interviews, or were they transcribed? Do you still have the audio?
They were transcribed.
Okay.
By yours truly. It's hard, as you know, it's hard to use them if you don't transcribe them.
Yes, but the time and money that goes into transcription, it's an investment. It's an investment.
Well, in my case, it's just time.
Well, as long as you don't pay yourself, you're good. So we were talking before how that the oral history program, or the oral history project, I suppose, was handed off from France to you.
Yeah.
How did that happen? What was the sort of mechanism for that?
Well, first of all, the France project had, as I recall, 5 interviewers.
Wow, okay.
And they would focus on different areas,
Sure,
like economic policy, foreign policy, things of that nature. And when they handed it off to me, it was just yours truly. And, I
know the feeling.
Well, I would try to see people that they had not seen,
Sure.
or people that I thought needed more attention than they had received. And I think we started out pretty modestly, really, because it was the longer I was there, the larger my travel budget, interview budget became, and I did that until we moved to Washington in 1991. Yeah.
Did you ever? I assume most people that you reached out to were more than willing to participate in the program. Were there any folks that were reluctant, or that you really had to work them to get them on tape? Or
Well,
to
I
sit.
think Senator Russell, mainly because of his health, I think
Yeah.
his staff was pretty protective of him.
Which is a shame because of that.
Yeah,
What,
Bob Dole, Senator Dole, I didn't get to see Senator Dole. I got to meet him, but maybe if I had pushed harder, he might have agreed to do it. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I didn't. There weren't many people that just said no flat
right,
out.
right.
You always get someone that doesn't want to do it for some reason.
Yeah, it's usually, oh, I don't have anything. Nobody cares. I don't have anything important to say. That's usually it's modesty, whether true or false modesty. I don't know.
Well, for me, the exciting thing of oral history, you never really know exactly what you're going to get. You can come there with your outline and your research and everything, but they may open a whole new avenue of topics that you were not prepared.
Well, and I'm sure you've talked to students, history students, museum studies, public history, what have you. And that's the number one thing that I've always tried to impress is that you may have 20 questions, but this is not going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. That's not how this works. This is like a child drawing on a wall with a crayon. You're hopping back and forth. It's a very active process.
Yeah. You don't want yes, no answers.
No.
You want a narrative. You want
yes, no question. I mean, I've had some interviews where you ask that, and they're like, yes, I think that's true, and you're like, oh boy. And it's like, well, let me ask that a different way. But yeah, you're 100% correct. You never know what you're going to get, and everyone's different, and every interview is different. Every person's different.
I used the reel-to-reel Tandberg that was.
Is that the reel-to-reel that's sitting over?
No, that's mine. But this one was more portable. It was a smaller one, but it would use those 7-inch reels.
Okay.
Aerovox Tandberg. So it was really a professional machine. And I was probably the last one in the country to shift to cassettes. And if I went to D.C. from Austin, say for a week or 2 weeks, my luggage was so heavy with all the 7-inch reels I had to take.
At least you didn't have to go through TSA back then. You should see sometimes when I have to explain to the TSA agents what's in the bag. It's like, well, it's film equipment. But I get extra screening quite often going through security. Well, in your whole time at the LBJ doing those interviews, what were maybe your favorite interview, the most memorable interview? Sometimes that's not the same thing. A memorable interview may be a terrible interview. I don't know.
Well, of course, one of my favorites was Lady Bird Johnson.
Sure.
Who was very committed to this project, and my staff and I would go through all of her letters and schedules and everything we could find that would bring a particular year to light in her memory. And then I would send the material to her ahead of time, and then we would sit in that yellow sitting room and sort of discuss it, and she would make notes, and we would do one day or 1 week or whatever the time period was on this one interview. It might take 2 or 3 hours to do that interview, and it would be limited maybe the night they met or the day they met, and the courtship, first day they spent together.
So a real deep dive into discrete topics.
She knew exactly what I wanted, and she wanted to accomplish the same thing, to really tell her story in the kind of detail that.
And if I recall, her spoken word was like an art form. The way that she spoke was so well formed, well thought out, that it was like she had it written in prose before she
She
spoke.
had a beautiful command of the language. She really did, and she did not try to gussy it up at all. You know, she used her expressions and accents, and East Texas came through loud and clear. But I remember one time I was sitting in my office and she called me up, and her first words were, "Hello, Mike. How would you like to do something zany?" And I thought, what could the former First Lady possibly mean by zany?
What's her definition of zany?
And she invited me to accompany her to her 50th high school reunion at Marshall High School. And
that qualifies.
oh, did it ever. And taking the Johnson's plane to Shreveport. Liz Carpenter came along, and the Secret Service met us in Shreveport. And then we went to the brick house where she was born, the antebellum house where she grew up, and Caddo Lake. We got John boats and went out of that beautiful moss-covered cypress area. Anyway, that was really a special thing. That was a bonus for someone doing oral history.
Yeah.
To actually experience those places, those landmarks in her life.
Right.
And to see her with her former classmates and whatnot.
Now, did you ever have a chance to interview or get close to the Johnson children?
I did. I interviewed Linda and Lucy. Lucy was over here the other night, as a matter of fact. Lucy and her husband were here the other night for a party. But I never had the kind of day-to-day, year-to-year intensity that I did with Mrs. Johnson.
Sure.
Of course, they had a different, yeah.
So another part of your job title was acquisitions. When did that come about? And what was that acquisitions of privately held papers as opposed to transfers from Washington?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, these were individuals who were willing to donate
Sure.
their papers to the library. And actually that fit pretty well with oral history because if you were interviewing them, they were making an investment in the library there, and their papers were likely to follow. It didn't always happen that way.
Yep.
But,
yeah. That's been my experience as well. So tell me about, you got your PhD in 1984-ish?
that sounds about right.
Sounds about right?
Yeah.
So tell me about what was your dissertation topic, and how did you I guess not cash in on, but use your work at the LBJ Library? Did those two come together?
Well, not really. My dissertation, which I did under Joe France was the head of my committee, was a history of the NAACP in Texas, dealing with the white primary battle and the Sweat v. Painter, the desegregation
Smith v.
of the law
Allwright.
school. But it was looking at the organization as a political organization and the branches in different cities. And by this time, I had interviewed a lot of the surviving NAACP leaders in Texas. I'll never forget traveling to Tyler and Texarkana and North Texas, and on weekends when I had more reading to do and studying to do for comprehensive exams, and yet here I am on the highway, trying to see Reverend Epps, John Epps, who was 90 years old. And heavily involved in the NAACP. I was fully occupied at the time, and my wife, Leanne, when we started dating, she started taking pictures of some of the NAACP leaders. She was a photographer.
Okay.
And we got to know a lot of these people. They became friends of ours, and it was really a wonderful experience. It was more than just a dissertation. It was really a relationship that developed with a lot of these wonderful people. And,
Spoken like a true oral historian.
yeah, well,
You spend that much time, and you go into an interview and you feel like you know this person's life better than they do.
Yeah.
We talked about earlier that your sort of introduction to Congress, the work of Congress, documenting Congress, really came in the mid 1980s when you were still at the LBJ Library, and the with D.B. Hardeman and what became the Encyclopedia of the Congress. Tell me about that.
Well, the LBJ Library received a bequest from D.B. Hardeman, who had been Sam Rayburn's right-hand man in Congress for years, and was an honorary congressional fellow, and was a beloved older figure in Congress. And in any event, when D.B. passed away, he left a bequest to the library, in addition to his 10,000 volumes of history books, to the library. But D.B. hoped that this bequest would be used to focus on and expand the study of Congress, and so one of the outcomes of that was a 4-volume encyclopedia of Congress that we got some help from what at the time was a somewhat unwilling commission on the bicentennial, chaired by former Chief Justice Warren Burger.
And to be clear, this is the bicentennial of Congress, not
Yes.
the U.S. bicentennial.
Yes.
Right. So
that effort, that endeavor really, I think, codified my close friendship with Dick Baker and Ray Smock.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
with whom I would work when I moved to Washington for the legislature.
Took the words right out of my mouth. So during this time, you were the encyclopedia is sort of mid 1980s, from about 88 to 91. You work for the library, but you're also working for the School of Public Affairs, the LBJ
Right.
School for Public Affairs. How did your work change when you were sort of, I don't know, posted at the LBJ school or lended out? I don't know the proper term.
Well, I never had an office at the LBJ school. I did have an office on campus. I did on the main campus, separate from the LBJ library. I did have an office there, and I had a staff there that processed the interviews. This project was all related to the 1988 presidential election, the Bush 1 versus Dukakis election. Mm-hmm. And I recorded about 400 interviews on
400 interviews.
I was busy.
Man.
Traveling a lot.
Right. Oh my goodness.
And these were this was, you'll appreciate this as an oral historian, the subjects were so much younger than the people I had interviewed for the LBJ years.
Oh, absolutely.
This was a generation or so younger. And it was interesting. It was enjoyable to get to know these people on both sides of the aisle, the Republicans and Democrats. So.
I don't think the general public has a real appreciation or an understanding that the staffs of these campaigns and congressional offices are these are run by kids, college kids. College graduates. They're adults. But these are young people. I remember the first time I visited a congressional office, and everybody was younger than me. And I'm 37, so I'm not exactly old by any means. But yeah, I think that's a really good thing to capture and to show to people that these are young men and women.
They were. They're very, very young, very smart, very energetic, and they could open doors for you too. If you got in with if one of them had a positive experience, that made it easy for them to call a friend and say, "Hey, I wish you'd spend some time."
Those staffs tend to be, not always, tend to be very close knit, very close knit. At least the upper, higher level staffers. Interns obviously come and go, and the folks who throw the mail and whatnot.
Yeah.
But so, how do you go from doing 400 interviews on the 1988 election to helping to organize and preserve the records of the U.S. House and Senate?
Well, the Legislative Archives job had been established by my predecessors, so really I was just sort of continuing what they had started. I don't know. Of course, by this time by the time I took that job, I had a very close professional relationship and personal friendship with both Dick Baker, the Senate historian, and Ray Smock. And Don Ritchie, who worked with Dick, and I had worked together in oral history Association for years. So it was not like I needed to get acquainted with these guys. It worked out very well, and they were extremely supportive, and we collaborated well. We didn't always agree, but we usually did. They wanted the center to succeed,
right.
and they were big fans and advocates for the National Archives. They really were.
Right. Institutionalists to their core. Now, how big of a transition was it from someone who worked primarily in oral history and collections acquisitions, to managing a working archive?
Well, I had a considerable staff at the LBJ Library, and we had the additional portfolio of taking on special projects, organizing symposia, doing other public program activities. So it was a versatile staff there, probably a little more versatile than the archive staff was, but that changed after I got there. And I hired some very creative young people who fit right in with the old senior archivists who had been there for 20, 30 years. But these younger people did more outreach. We created some document packets for high school teachers to use with their students. One on women addressing Congress on important issues. Another one on Thomas Jefferson and his writings.
A founding father you could actually read and understand.
Absolutely, yeah. So we did that. We got a huge collection of cartoons from, I'm trying to think of the name of the cartoonist, a very famous cartoonist in the early 20th century. We inherited maybe 1,000 drawings that he had, and utilized a lot of those in exhibitions and things of this nature.
So was that something that when you were brought on board, you related to me a very interesting phone call you received, and this is obviously taking a step back, but when you were brought in to Center for Legislative Archives, were you given a charge, or was it said, or were you told, use all your skills and powers and make this a position that you want?
I think that everyone wanted me to expand the visibility of the legislative archives, the legislative records, and to have the resources benefit the public more, particularly in an educational setting. The as you know, Dick Baker and then Ray Smock were very focused on the House and Senate, and we may have strayed somewhat in that in becoming a little more expansive in our but I think they appreciated the fact that we were getting the records into the schools and making Congress. The presidency was not the only institution of government that deserved to be in the classroom, and I think the staff came up with some very innovative projects that put Congress right in the middle of the historical studies.
What were some of the primary challenges you faced in working in the Center for Legislative Archives? Maybe hurdles that you had to overcome or things like that?
Well, one of the hurdles that, if as a federal employee, it was very difficult to get people on staff, and the people who in St. Louis or Kansas City, wherever they were, that approved the hires, they didn't always have the same criteria in mind that you had. So it was not easy to hire really quality people. It happened, but it was laborious, I would say.
Not every hire is a winner.
It was a job that I loved, and I had a very talented staff. There were some old people that had been there forever, and they were good at what they did, and there were some young people who were not as knowledgeable, but had tremendous energy and resourcefulness, and they certainly helped have that energy.
How did the nature of your work change over the course of the 12 or so years that you were there?
Well, there were
other than technology, obviously, which is constantly evolving.
The person I worked with at the archives more closely than anyone else was John Constance, who was in charge of legislative affairs for the archives. He was the lobbyist for the archives on Capitol Hill, and John and I were great friends, still are, and we were always concocting some initiative to make people appreciate the historical records of Congress, or get members where they could show their constituents things that were really special to, say, a particular state or congressional district.
Right.
And John was he's left the archives now, but he was a very creative, innovative guy who was just so skillful at dealing with members.
Right.
And of course, that was a big part of my job too. I got to know a lot of members, and we had a lot of support on the Hill. I'll give you one example, though. There was a minority member, Republican member from Florida, who was a freshman, and when he brought a group from, I think it was Pensacola, to the archives, we rolled out the red carpet as if this guy is the most influential guy on the Hill. We had all kinds of wonderful letters, historical letters from his district that we could show, in the treasure vault or make facsimiles of, so that his constituents could see it. And anyway, he was just thrilled and became our lifelong friend. Before I left, he called John Constance and me in and wanted to give us the FTC building for legislative archives. He was really pissed off at the FTC for some reason. And by this time, he had enough power where he thought he might be able to vacate that,
Well, he would have been in the Republican majority at that time. Well, the Center for Legislative Archives just moved into the old government printing office. That's where it's been.
oh, is that right?
Yep.
See, I didn't even know
Yep.
that.
Well, speaking of Republican Democrats, when I would talk to Ray and Dick and Don about their time and their experiences, now obviously they were embedded in the House and Senate, in the Senate and the clerk's office, Ray in the Speaker's office. When power shifted away from the Democrats to the Republicans, that there was concern within their staffs, their offices, about what this actually meant. As somebody who was working in National Archives, were you insulated from the ripple effects of those power shifts? And that's a yes or no question that I shouldn't ask, but
Well, and that's a good question. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. I think I felt pretty comfortable in my work under both administrations. Coming from Texas, we had ties to both parties, and I felt, frankly, that there was a lot of enthusiasm for the National Archives on both sides of the aisle. And I mean, some of my closest friends, for example, Steve Horn, he was a Republican. And I had no stronger friend or supporter on the Hill than Steve. But I mean, I myself was and remain a Democrat, but I certainly recognize that, power changes,
right.
and
The only constant is change.
we try to serve both sides of the aisle, really, and of course, at that time, I spent, the person I got to know best was John Glenn, and I spent more time with him, but some of his closest friends were Republican members of the Senate. He was very close to some of those guys.
How did you get to know Senator Glenn so well? As somebody who lived and worked in Texas most of their life, how did you get to know the senior senator from Ohio? Well, I guess he wasn't senior until Howard Metzenbaum lost, but anyway.
Yeah, well, it didn't take. He quickly.
Yeah.
I don't know how that. Maybe I could give you sort of a sense of how it happened, but his staff, the Mary Jane Vino, who I think was his chief of staff, talked to Dick Baker and maybe John Constance, our legislative guy. Dick being the Senate historian and John being
Right.
about I think it was Senator Glenn's papers, and his inclination to take them to Muskingum, where he and Annie had graduated. I had met Senator Glenn before, but I didn't really have much interaction with him. But anyway, when we started talking about his legacy in the papers, I did go over and meet with him, and I made this argument that they needed to go to Ohio State, that was the only institution that had the bandwidth to take the kind of care of his papers that they deserve.
Because by this point, you understood what an undertaking a congressional, not just a congressional collection, but how expansive his personal collection.
Yeah, no, it's you could tell that. And I mean, the senators would all accumulate significant documentation. In his case, of course, they had all the artifacts too from his space flight and everything.
Right, we're not talking plaques and trophies here. We're talking helmets and patches and suits.
Anyway, and then I started the other thing, it was clear to me that he didn't just want the papers to gather dust. He wanted to create something that would encourage young people to get involved in public service.
Right.
And so I became sort of his aide informally on how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I had him write to a number of college presidents, for example, to get their thoughts on what to do. In any event, what came out of this discussion, we made a trip to Stanford to look at what they were doing.
Like the Hoover Institute or Stanford
No,
libraries?
it was broader than
Okay.
the Hoover Institute. It was a broader thing. But Adrienne Jameson, who was the head of Stanford's Washington program, Stanford and Washington program, she went with us. Stanford had the very best Washington internship program there was, and a lot of that was her expertise. But anyway, the decision was, well, if you want to get into this at Ohio State, let's see what other institutions are doing, and let's start with Stanford. So anyway, we started this. I mean, that was and he came to Austin too. I mean, and talked to the people at the LBJ school. I flew down with him on that, and then we went to Stanford. But a lot of it was learning what it took to create some sort of public policy or public affairs school that would train people to be interested in government and to excel in this. And so this was an evolution. I can't tell you how satisfying it has been to see the outcome. You know, after these years, we were in Washington recently for a program with the Glenn College students, presenting an award to the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, I think.
You know, I mean, when I think back, and you're talking about this, Senator Glenn retired in '97. Yeah, '97. It seemed like he was somebody who took a much more hands-on approach to building that school, that legacy. Than, and I don't mean this disparagingly to others. This was more than just his name slapped on a building.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was great to work with. Our group, the board of directors, it included some academics and some people who were old friends of his as well. And I remember one time he kept talking about maybe having a trip on an aircraft carrier. Nobody took him seriously until we were told that our next meeting was going to take place in San Diego. It would include an extra day aboard an aircraft carrier, the Stennis, one of the Navy's newest ones, and since it was 80 miles out in the Pacific Ocean, we
had to fly out there.
Well, we spent a whole day on the carrier. Well, that's the sort of thing that creates a lasting memory.
I guess you're just lucky he didn't drag you along on the space shuttle in '98.
Well, we did go to the launch.
You did?
We took the kids
That's
out
great.
of school, and
I can remember watching it as a kid. I was 11, 12 years old.
We were told ahead of time that we wouldn't be able to see him because all the astronauts were in quarantine.
Yeah.
But actually, that was not correct. They were separated from us by a small street, a road. But we could stand across the road and talk to them and take pictures.
Social distancing before we knew what that was.
Oh, that was a great thrill to see that.
Yeah, like I said, I can remember watching, that was, for a while, after the Challenger, I mean, that was a big thing for the space program to be able to,
and
to
all
focus
all of his crewmates came to his funeral. That was really something to see.
Wow. How much, we've talked about your relationship with, Don and Ray and Dick. How much interaction did you have with the archivists, Karen Paul in the Senate, Cynthia Miller, Robin Reeder in the House? How much interaction did you have with them and their work in?
Well, I guess not as much, but if it was something having to do with documents, then they were likely to get involved. And certainly when we were trying to create this collective body of archivists for political repositories. Karen took the lead on that, and all of us were supportive of her, and Cynthia Miller and other folks. You know, we worked with them, and I think there was probably some programs that we worked collaboratively on. I can't.
Now, did you take an active role, or were you? Did you attend some of these sort of marquee milestone conferences in the preservation of congressional records? There's the Margaret Chase Smith meeting up in
We
Maine.
did go to one of those. What I remember most about that, if it's the same one you're referring to, was we got a car and Ray Smock drove us up to LL Bean, I think it was, and they were open in the middle of the night. We got there about midnight, and it was just like high noon. Now you wouldn't believe all the people in that store.
When you need boots, you need boots.
Yeah, but that was a fun. That whole conference was a really. Frank Mackaman, I think, organized it.
Yeah,
and
Frank.
Everything else Frank did, it was well done. Yeah.
What could you sense that there was, a critical mass of because this was a time where big things were happening in terms of collecting, providing access, and convincing the public and others that these records had real value that deserved to be preserved and accessed and used by researchers, students, scholars alike.
I probably was not as focused on the users as I was on the conservation and it was very rare that I would go into the reading room.
Right.
Maybe if someone was working on a particular topic and they needed my involvement for some reason, I'd get involved. But I spent so little time really with researchers. I spent a lot more time with members of Congress. I know one was trying to liberate the House papers that had been, they were going to keep them on seal. What was and they agreed to open them up.
Ray would know.
It was controversial, but I talked to the clerk and the committee chair and the ranking minority, and just said, if you don't I know what they were. They were the communist.
The House Un-American Activities.
Yes, the HUAC records, and they were going to be under seal for 50 years, and we reached that landmark, and the House was not inclined to open them. And I said, if you don't open these things up now, you're going to be really embarrassed by it. I said, if you let me open them now, I can assure you that there won't be any scandals. If there's something that would, some explosion, I will check it out before it happens, before we make it available. and they agreed to do that, and they never got any peep out of it at all.
Well,
That stuff was, I looked at it, it was tame stuff by comparison, really.
sure. You know, what was the main thrust of your argument? Look, the rumor mill, you know, in the absence of the records, you know, people's imaginations will run
That
wild
was right.
here, and
That's right.
they'll say you're covering something up.
And I had seen enough of it to know that it was just, it was not that interesting.
Not yeah, right. There, not everything was the Hollywood blacklist. Tell me about your work with the advisory committee on the records of Congress, which would have been relatively new. It's in its first year or so when you took your post.
Yeah, I didn't have. I remember we had that meeting out at the Ray Smock's operation and with the Bird Center.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the early meetings, and the center was brand new at the
Mm-hmm.
time and had a lot of possibilities. You know, I wasn't that involved in the organization. Really, I would go to a few of the meetings, but I was gone by the time it really got going.
Well, as we wrap up, what convinced you? Was this just once again that magnetic pull of Texas dragging its native son back to it within its borders, or what convinced you to step away from Washington and come back to Texas?
Well, yeah, my wife and I had met in Austin. We'd both gone to school here at the university, and I didn't actually know what my next career would be, but I had 30 years of federal service, so I had a full retirement there, and we were, you know, we both had aging parents that we needed to be closer to, and it worked out very well. You know, I enjoyed my time at Humanities Texas, State Humanities Council, and it.
What was the crux of the job with Humanities Tech? Was it much like Georgia Humanities or the Georgia Humanities Council was named before? Was it mainly grants and sub-grants to educators and libraries and others, or programs that you yourself led?
A lot of programming. In fact, it's still doing a lot of professional development programs for classroom teachers.
National History Day?
Yeah, of course. But yeah, very active, and worked a lot with the LBJ Library, organizing major symposia on relevant topics, things of this nature. It was interesting to me because I had never thought of Texas as a whole. There were large parts of the state that I had never really become familiar with, and this job gave me a totally different sense of my home state. You know,
Did you finally get over to Loving County and the hundred or so people who live in Loving County? No offense to, although it's very likely that anybody in Loving County would. It's such a small slice of the population.
You see the state differently, and you appreciate the diversity of this state. That meant a lot.
I mean, it's Georgia is the largest geographic state east of the Mississippi. You get west of the Mississippi, and there's a lot of territory to cover, especially in the state of Texas.